And welcome back, everyone, to yet another edition of Going for Two, presented by our friends at Home Field Apparel. I am your host, the publisher of the Extra Points newsletter, Matt Brown. I'm joined by my colleague and friend, Bryan Fischer. Bryan, you just told me something very interesting right before you hit the record button. Is this our 99th episode?
That is what the old podcast software says. This is number 99. So we're hitting triple digits. We can go into syndication now next week, and not like we're going to get the big bonus check that a TV show would get for hitting that marquee number. But yeah, 100 episodes, which is accomplishing quite a bit in the podcast world.
And that puts us in pretty rarefied air in the podcast world, especially for an extremely niche newsletter. So maybe we'll have to do something fun here for next week. And you might forgive us for having not planned that in advance, like 6 months from now, because
well, our planning has been thrown out the window, right? Yeah, I think the events of the last about a week and a half, I think, has certainly pushed all of that aside. So any planning that we would have had has probably would have been long past due anyway. So.
Completely. I want to talk about some of the realignment related developments over the last, 48, 72 hours. We are recording this episode here on Tuesday, the 5th in the afternoon. But before we do, there was something I wanted to talk to you about. I really haven't even had a chance to do this yet because of the world. Tell me about NACDA. So for those that don't know, because our audience for Going for Two is kind of 50-50. NACDA is a gigantic conference. It was in Las Vegas for athletic directors and senior athletic officials and everybody in the world that wants to sell stuff to those people. And it is a great time to go, not just to, actually go to clinics and classes and share best practices and everything, but like any other convention, you grab people at the hotel bar in the lobby and you can have a chance to more informally discuss things. This entire event was before USC and UCLA announced a move, or the news broke. I want to say that was like the day or two after you came back. I missed it because I was, ceremonially unclean to travel because I was still testing positive for the coronavirus. Bryan, tell me about the trip. What did you learn? Who did you talk to? What was going on there?
Well, it was tremendous fun to be back in person with everybody in Las Vegas. I think for folks, everybody in whatever industry you might be in, you tend to have that kind of yearly conference where everybody gets together. This is college athletics kind of go to, and certainly there are other places where the NCAA convention, conference media days, whatnot, spring meetings in Arizona that we went to a while back. But like NACDA is really kind of the one place that everybody does gather, and it's not just athletic directors, as you mentioned, a lot of senior administrators, a lot of people just kind of coming up in the industry. This is kind of like the coaches convention in that respect, where you can network, you can learn from sessions. I mean, this is where the compliance world kind of comes together and discusses best practices and understands what's going on in the industry. What are the changes going on? I mean, I think that was generally the topic du jour of everything that really every conversation prior to USC and UCLA leaving at NACDA was all about NIL. Division I transformation, and really there were a ton of D2, D3 folks, NAIA folks were there. So it's not just about kind of the highest levels of FBS football or anything like that. It really was the entire NCAA college athletics ecosystem coming into one place, and a lot of tremendous conversations that we will have on Collegiate Sports Connect. If you're not already a user, please go ahead and sign up. But we had, I counted the other day, 99 interviews with ADs, CEOs, people throughout the industry. I mean, it was a tremendous event, huge success on our end, I think, from speaking from the D1 Ticker folks and Collegiate Sports Connect, but tremendous to just be in person and have some of those industry conversations, some of which were rendered moot about 24 hours later.
I am still trying to work my way through watching a lot of those interviews. And I imagine it's going to take me a couple of weeks just because there were so many of them. And I'm trying to kind of pull out a couple of things. I know that there was the interview with Chicago State's interim athletic director, talked a little bit about what they're looking for a new conference and some of the strategic changes that are happening there. For individuals that are not likely to watch all 99 of these, were there any of these conversations that you found were especially insightful, or something you're like, wow, I really didn't know that? I know that you had a conversation with, somebody that our video game enthusiast friends might be interested to know that you talked to.
Yeah, the CLC CEO, Corey, and it was fascinating because it was not just, the CLC CEO. We talked with Paciolan's CEO, who runs basically every ticketing operation, across athletics. If you have a mobile app to scan into a football game or a basketball game, Paciolan's generally got to deal with your school or at least one of your rival schools that you have to work with them. We're discussing with a lot of ADs. We had Julie Cromer from the Division I Transformation Committee, had about a half-hour conversation with her just about the entire process, what's next, your discussions about enforcement. And I tell you what, it was also great to meet a lot of people, not only up on stage, but just kind of walking around the convention that said they were listeners of Going for Two. We interviewed a couple of them. We talked to them about it before and after, but it was great to talk with everybody. And I think, again, I think the common theme throughout NACDA was always NIL. From whether you're talking about a compliance administrator, whether you're talking about an AD, I mean, that really was top of mind for really everybody. I mean, it was just, how can we best position our program? How do we work with coaches about learning the latest rules? What's coming down the pipeline in terms of transformation that might impact NIL? What are companies looking at in terms of how they approach this space, how they're working with schools, how they're working with brands and marketers across the country. So I think there was a lot of conversations centered on that. And I think truly, if you're talking about some of our discussions at that D1 AAA level, and even kind of those smaller schools at the FBS level, a lot of it, there was some concern about championship access. I heard that quite a bit in Las Vegas. I think that is top of mind for everybody. There's some vague things kind of thrown out there. We did discuss it with Julie Cromer. I'm just not getting the sense that everybody's kind of happy at the lack of information over what that might look like. That is certainly a big topic for discussion over the next couple of months. Heading into that convention in January down in San Antonio, when the NCAA really meets and decides on a lot of this stuff. But that was top of mind for, I think, a lot of folks. If it wasn't an NIL related discussion, it was definitely, how can we make sure that our teams are getting access to that NCAA tournament, how that they're getting access to NCAA golf or NCAA, the College World Series or something like that. So that, I think is prominent on the minds of a lot of folks that are really not necessarily dealing in those 9-figure NIL deals.
I think that would match honestly with some of the conversations that we were having at the last kind of convention that we went to. And we'll have to follow up more with the specifics. This idea of, does championship access mean guaranteed play-in access? Does it mean that there's some rounds before the big championship? And that, from my own kind of one AAA conversations, having not been in NACDA, but just kind of generally, there's been more concern over that than there is about money. Because they're like, there's this kind of assumption that whatever the committee's final recommendations are next January, it's going to result in more money for power leagues. Or more established brands. What that looks like for championships, bigger question. Is there a world where for college baseball, that if you win the NEC, you play a 3-game series with like the MAC before you move on to the regionals or something, rather than immediately getting to pitch against Florida? I don't know. Maybe it seems like those are the kind of open questions that are happening right now.
Yeah, and we discussed that a lot of that with the NCAA CFO, who's retiring later this year, Kathleen McNeely. I mean, she was very informative in terms of just kind of what's going on across the association, just going through the budgeting process. Like looking at this year in particular, this is the kind of the first full cycle they've had in terms of after the gender equality report, going through the entire NCAA tournament runs on the men and women's basketball side, and how that whole process worked, because they changed a lot of the kind of budgeting principles around that. And maybe there are some takeaways. I think they are, for my conversations, not just at NACDA, but kind of across the industry, bringing some of those principles to other sports, other championships is certainly on the table. I think the revenue distribution plan is going to change significantly for a lot of schools out there. So there's just a whole lot of discussion points, and even travel. I mean, it was funny. I mean, like everybody, it seemed like a lot of people there at NACDA did have some sort of travel issue. If you've been in an airport recently, you understand that completely right now.
Oh
but
my gosh, yeah.
And it is just wild. And baking into that cost, I mean, you're talking about not only inflationary increases in things like concessions and labor and all those other kind of minor things that ADs and CFOs of schools have to kind of consider, but it's an industry-wide topic as well, on top of everything else that is going on.
It's funny you mentioned travel, because that is something I am really trying to wrap my arms around right now. So on Tuesday, today's Tuesday. On Wednesday, on Extra Points, if you're not a paying subscriber, but we're publishing a story talking about a paper that was published with through a couple of academics in late December that interviewed a lot of athletes who play football and who play hockey in major conferences and do a lot of national cross-country travel about what that experience means from the athlete's perspective. And it was actually more mixed than I had expected. It definitely wasn't uniformly negative, because a lot of people are happy to tell you, listen, those long flights, those hotel trips, those nights out, not only just to give me a chance to see the country, which a lot of athletes have not done before they get to college. A lot of people don't leave their state other than to go on vacation once or twice. But also, this is where team culture is built. This is why a lot of basketball teams go to Europe, every couple of years, to put people in uncomfortable situations and make them spend a ton of time with each other, and you end up as friends, or you become blood enemies, and sometimes that tears down cultures too. But that's all part of the travel. But the logistical side is significant, and this was before travel became, I think, airline travel became much more difficult. But most people don't charter for their flights, even in the Big Ten, even in the SEC, even in big schools. The football teams do. The volleyball team doesn't always right now, which means that a lot of people are getting stuck in O'Hare. They're getting stuck in Atlanta, or they're riding buses. And increasingly, it's hard to get bus drivers.
I heard that more than once at the convention. Like, it is difficult to find bus drivers. Like, you would not put that on kind of the top of your mind if you're just kind of thinking about college athletics travel. But I definitely heard that quite a few times there at NACDA.
Hard to get bus drivers. Also, sometimes hard to get rental cars. So I have heard two things, and I won't share the school because I don't want to get anybody in trouble. They're two different schools. This was within the last year. I've heard of one, football coaches unable to secure rental cars after traveling. Have went out into like Home Depot and rented pickup trucks, or moving vehicles in order to actually like go to high schools and make visits. And then you kind of brush it off as this is just our blue collar mentality. This was not Texas. This was not a school with Texas money, but like this is a thing in the recruiting world. If you are not flying into a gigantic metro area, I have also heard that it is more common than you think for somebody who is not CDL certified. So like an assistant coach or a dobo, sometimes even an athlete, driving the van or the bus, particularly to get from the airport to the hotel because they can't get anybody right there. Terrible for insurance reasons, terrible for a bunch of other reasons. But if you got to get to Greeley, Colorado, sometimes you have to do things and you don't tell your compliance officer about them. That's part of what travel is about. If you are listening to this and you're like, yeah, this is my world, I'd love to tell you about some of these things. My email is matt@extrapointsmb.com. This is something I'm going to be picking at, I think, for the next several weeks, because conference realignment, not just with the Pac-12 and the Big Ten, I think makes this a much more significant issue.
Absolutely. I mean, Kathleen McNeely, the NCAA CFO, she said NCAA is kind of budgeting travel costs to go up 30% compared to last year. So that just kind of gives you a kind of perspective. And that's just the national office when you're talking about championship travel and moving teams all around. I mean, it is pretty crazy the amount of booking they have to do in such a short span. And maybe we'll have more on that at a later date. But that's a cost that not necessarily is getting passed along to schools, but schools are feeling it even more so because they have to plan just your general conference travel. And I think given the UCLA and USC news in particular, I think travel is top of mind for a lot of those Olympic sports right now in terms of figuring things out. But we could see some schools get creative. I think we joked off air kind of before this about schools buying planes and whatnot. Well, you know what? That actually sounds pretty good right about now when you're talking about just the cost savings you could get over a long-term period, even though it might be a little bit expensive on the balance sheet to purchase a used Fokker jet or something like that, or an Embraer. Like, at the end of the day, it might end up paying it for itself when you talk about some of these increased travel costs.
I joke a lot on Twitter. If you have the misfortune of following me on Twitter, you should know that I do not take that format particularly seriously, and I'm making jokes all the time. I'm not joking about buying a jet, and not just because suddenly you're pulling in between revenue, media distributions, and ticket sales. All these other places are looking at 200 million plus potentially for your entire athletic department. But these are also people that have alums in the entertainment world and in the corporate finance world and in the business world that could potentially cut you a deal. on something like this. And if you suddenly have to charter, 28 sports teams, that's a thing to consider. Sure, it's a big cost, but a lot of universities have planes. Rather, a lot of big universities,
including your alma mater at Ohio State.
I would imagine Ohio State has more than one plane.
Actually, I believe they have 2 or 3 planes, but those are kind of the smaller jets, kind of more the business travel jets. But it's fun. You go back a couple of years, the new, I think even maybe it might have been last year, but the New England Patriots, they bought 2, I believe 767s off the user market, just because really when you're thinking about the charter travel. At the university level, you're behind NBA teams, you're behind NFL teams. And when it can kind of get that crunch, you might be, having to wait on a jet to fly in to pick you up. And so when you're talking about some missing class and some of the academic components with that travel cost, if you can afford it, you know what, when it works much better for your schedule, we could start to see some creative solutions again from some of these universities and some of these athletic departments about kind of figuring out that travel picture, not in terms of time savings, but also cost savings.
You can always sublet the jet, which is I think what the Patriots have done too. When you buy it and you basically Airbnb it to other people. Take it from me, somebody who repeatedly flies on Spirit Airlines. I know all about the world of jets. Mr. I got a C+ from Ohio State and, was a blogger for 10 years. Yeah, this is definitely my world. Before we talk a little bit more about realignment, I did want to go back, just double back to something which I know is relevant to our audience. What did you learn from conversations with CLC or some of the other folks in licensing about any of these kind of sponsored products? I don't want to overstate this. I've said this on the air. I said this to the Washington Post. There's no level of minutia that's too minute for people that care about this world. What did you guys talk about? What takeaways did you have?
Yeah, it was a great conversation with Corey Moss, who's been at CLC for a couple of decades. I think he's been there for quite a while, and just kind of going through that process of working with schools, and you wrote this kind of a bit in your newsletter that are not CLC partners. They're still dealing with them trying to get audio assets and get stadium renderings, and it's a lot of work. They are certainly hopeful that they will hit that 2023 deadline of kind of next summer to get the game out, but a lot of it is just kind of usual work that they have to do as part of their clients. You've written extensively on. I don't think he broke any news necessarily. I think the interesting thing that I took away from that is that yes, I think they are saying once this kind of model gets proven out, maybe it's a little bit easier to do a college basketball game, college baseball game. There's obviously a lot of focus on women's basketball right now. Maybe there's a women's basketball video game that could become a part of this ecosystem as they just kind of build out those assets and keep things going. And I think it's going to be interesting to look at the licensing component, how they've worked with the Brander Group and doing more group licensing components. Everybody's been very insistent on this being an opt-in for a lot of the athletes, and so I'm very curious. He didn't really, he kind of dodged the question just a little bit about, all right, if you're a high-profile quarterback and you do want to kind of hold back a little bit and try to get a better deal, what's that going to look like? I don't think anybody quite knows, but they all seem pretty confident about sewing up some of those loose ends by the time we kind of get into that production phase in 2023. But a lot of work still to be done. It's very rewarding for a lot of the folks that are at CLC that are working on the product. But it's not just flipping Madden around and reskinning the game. Like that, there is some true legwork that is being put into place both on CLC's part, from the school's part, and from EA Sports' part.
I would hope if anybody has read my coverage of the EA Sports and you get one takeaway, it should be this is not a Madden reskin. Can I promise you that the game will be good? No. I'd love to. They haven't given me a copy of the game yet because they're not done making it, so I can't promise that it will be good. I can't promise a particular gameplay feature, but I can tell you, knowing what I know about the development schedule and what I've known about how people are submitting very extremely specific assets, that it really is being built from the ground up. It's not the same kind of thing. I've called like 7 other schools today asking about this exact thing. I will update our original post on Extra Points about audio and visual assets as I get more of those. I have called every private school in FBS right now. The challenge is that often athletic directors don't have any idea what I'm talking about. It's usually somebody in external relations. I've been tracking down that person and the comm staff while they're waiting for the FOIA to come through. It could be a minute. Plus, a lot of these schools are a teensy bit busy right now with maybe some other structural problems. I want to talk about those
Well,
structural issues.
you mentioned structural
Yeah.
problems. I mean, I think that was another,
Yeah.
as part of our kind of connect product is obviously hiring and connecting folks that do have openings and facilitating that a little bit. And that was a big pain point from a lot of ADs around there. A lot of senior administrators. They're in the market for hiring folks, and it's a difficult market. If anybody understands some of the labor economics on going on across the country right now, it is particularly highlighted in athletics. People are needing 4 or 5 more SIDs, to beef up their sports information department. They're needing more fundraisers. They're needing more people just to do ops and do facilities. I mean, I can't tell you how many ADs were discussing, just the difficulty in finding trainers, which you would think, a lot of these universities are connected to their, school health systems or something like that. And, just the difficulty and the amount of turnover that they go through at a position like that is pretty remarkable. Just kind of hearing them, kind of understanding and trying to convey, how difficult it is to find some of those places that are really key for their athletic departments, their teams to keep humming along. And so I think that's another thing that a lot of ADs were, I wouldn't say griping about, but making sure that it is understandable that in addition to all the big topics about NIL and D1 transformation, there's some real tangible issues that college athletics is facing on things like hiring people.
Which is true for almost every industry. Like a lot of places are facing labor shortages, right? Like I don't know how it is where you are. Here in Chicago, like our pools just opened today rather than at a month and a half ago because there aren't enough lifeguards. Trains don't run as often as they used to because there aren't enough train operators or not enough bus drivers. And so it would make sense that, hey, there's people are having trouble finding enough .NET developers or fundraisers or people that can work scoreboards, especially because, not to completely blow up our corporate overlords here, but a lot of these jobs don't pay very much money and they're really, really hard jobs. And that's why we've also written a lot about burnout. It might be harder to find dobos because people are realizing going to graduate school, making $16,000 a year while working this really stressful, complicated job sucks. Or working in college athletic operations for 6 years and still making 42,000 and having to take care of the paint for the soccer field is a lousy gig, or at least a lousier gig than it was before. Fixing a lot of these things it takes money. It's not just money. It's how we manage, how we recruit, what kind of culture you're building, like with other jobs, but not an easy fix.
Well, I mean, even at the lower levels, the kind of D2, D3 level, they're almost better prepared to face a labor shortage like this because they're doing so much more. But the burnout aspect, I think, is the different thing right now. Like everybody is hyper aware of making sure that you are taking care of your own people, making sure that they are happy, making sure that they do have time off. They can go hang out with their families. They can take a bit of a vacation without necessarily worrying about work. I think that's especially coming out of the pandemic where things are not only opening up a lot more, but you just have been basically working nonstop for the past 2 years and under hard, tough conditions just to get your teams to play. And, making sure that your own folks are taking care of themselves is top of mind for a lot of ADs out there. And frankly, for a lot of administrators, because they're seeing people understandably shuffle off to the private sector, knowing you can have a bit more of a 9 to 5 and not deal with the stress that comes out with playing in college athletics.
One thing a boss could do, whether you work in college sports or quite frankly in any industry, as a gesture to show the other people on your team how much you care about them, how important they are to your organization's success. Buy them some stuff from Home Field Apparel, our friends, our title sponsors who make extremely comfortable, officially licensed collegiate apparel with unique vintage logos and designs. Like with most shows, I am wearing something Home Field right now. I'm wearing Boise State. That's another Bronco first down. We got some other home. I missed what you were.
Butler Bulldog. Got to go with the old Butler Bulldog.
It's a good dog, very good dog. Can skateboard. They've dropped some absolute heaters. I have spent a lot of my internet career, particularly in the extra points era, making fun of Nebraska. It's not personal. Lincoln is, I think, an absolutely lovely town. They are my Midwestern cousins. There's a lot that's very admirable about Nebraska. Truly, Nebraska women's volleyball was one of the greatest, like I think, in arena live experiences that I've had as a sports writer. I have also made the Scott Frost Day joke roughly 400,000 times, and I don't intend to stop. I will be buying some Nebraska stuff, which it's going to take a little minute to get here because, they're home field swamped right now. But that collection was outstanding. I'm going to get the Bug Eaters shirt because Nebraska used to be called the Bug Eaters, which is way better than Cornhuskers, even though Cornhuskers is very good. I think a truly unique and excellent old collection. They are announcing Oklahoma this week. Normally, when Oklahoma fans get noon releases, they launch conference realignment in motion and ultimately devastated the entire ecosystem of this sport. This seems to be a noon release they're going to be okay with. I think we are heading towards the end of this big new Saturday season. I don't want to tell you what school will be at the end of that season because I might jeopardize our licensing agreement. I will just say that while you should continue to spend lots of money supporting TCU and Nebraska and Oklahoma, you should also save some money for the end because the last school is going to be a humdinger. You can save some of that money by using our special promo code Extra Points, which will knock off 15% off your first order at checkout. You can also send me a note at matt@extrapointsmb.com if you'd like me to put you in touch with folks at Home Fields to get your school, your IP licensed with the good brand.
Please do that because especially if you're some of the D2, D3 schools, you have awesome logos as is. I can't imagine going into the archive, some of the stuff that the Home Field could come up with. I mean, just look at our good friends at the Colorado School of Mines. We interviewed the AD there at the Connect stage. I mean, they got some great stuff, always have. I think, just having that donkey around is definitely promoted the brand in ways that are a bit unexpected and finding it in other areas. But there's some great logos out there, and I think they would make perfect products on a Home Field. So make sure you are emailing Matt to get in touch with the folks back in Indianapolis.
Mines is a great example because unless you were a gigantic college football hipster and were posting about Bob Stitt when those games are basically on VHS at 11 o'clock at night, or if you're a mining engineer, you probably are not aware of that school, but you are aware of the donkey holding a stick of dynamite if you are a college football Twitter user over the last year and a half. I'm also just going to look. I've basically posted my way into a career at this point. Might as well not stop now. I'll be honest with you. The way that we're able to sustain this podcast is through sponsorships. The Home Field sponsorship is very important to us. One of the ways that we're able to, for all parties, make the sponsorship work is when we're able to say, hey, Home Field, we help to drive new licensures to your brand because we don't have, this is not the Paul Feinbaum show in terms of audience. I'm sorry to spoil that, right? So if you can't afford to buy a bunch of t-shirts or to drive other potential sponsors to this show or our newsletter, although that would be wonderful, helping to get Fairfield or Hartford or Linfield or, I don't know, Pacific or some other random school as part of this ecosystem makes Home Field want to also give us more money that we then use to not just do things like pay for our hosting fees, but also so we can buy more t-shirts too. It is the circle of the economy.
Very much a revenue neutral deal for us. The amount that we have plowed onto the Home Field trip.
Man, if I was good at business, I wouldn't be a professional newsletter writer. I'd be doing business. Even though I guess this is a business. Clearly I'm not because I have an addiction and that is extremely comfortable t-shirts. Okay. That ad read ran a little bit long. If you're listening this long, I know what you actually want to talk about. I know what we have to dig into here. It's been a couple of days, Bryan. What the hell's going on with conference realignment right now? What are we hearing? What are we not hearing? How should we be deciphering what's been blowing around? Because I feel like the reality and the immediate conventional wisdom might not be completely aligned here.
Yeah, I think everybody wants to get out ahead of the story at this point and say, so-and-so's talking to so-and-so. And you had a great tweet earlier this week about just in terms of, who is actually making these moves, how these big universities kind of turn their ship and change conferences. A lot of time that circle is kept tight, as the UCLA and USC move have proven, as the Texas and Oklahoma move have proven. I mean, really, you go back to that Texas OU move. There's really three people at UT that really knew what was going on and when. There was a select few, basically the same number at Oklahoma. pretty much the exact same thing happening at USC, UCLA. I mean, I was shocked making a few phone calls, this past week and sending some texts. Just the lack of communication between USC and UCLA until kind of the last kind of few weeks kind of surprised me in terms of going through this move. So actually, what is happening at the highest levels of these universities? Yes, your AD is going to be fairly involved somewhat, maybe not continuing to keep the pulse of everything going on. Yes, your school president is going to be the ultimate arbiter of where you're going and how these conversations take place. But it's going to be interesting this time around because you're involving so many schools. I think everybody kind of is looking out at, what's going to happen with the Big 12. How's the Pac-12 moving forward? That league just put out a statement saying they're moving forward with rights negotiations, even though they're entering their kind of negotiation period already. They've already been talking with ESPN and Fox as part of their exclusive window. So, at the end of the day, who's really kind of driving this next round of conference realignment. You can put the pinpoint squarely in South Bend, Indiana. That would be number one, and then number two is Fox and ESPN. Those are going to be the ultimate arbiters of where we're kind of going for this next round, I guess you could say.
Let me talk about that tweet here for a second. I want to help our listeners be better educated consumers, I think, of this kind of stuff. So I can tell you here, I think I've been nothing if not honest. I am not the most plugged in person at some of these Big 12, Pac-12, and Big 10 universities. And by that, I mean, like, not just the ADs, but like people above them. I have broken a bunch of conference realignment stories before, mostly at the G5 FCS 1 AAA level. And I can tell you from some of these about who actually knows about changing leagues for everything, right? Your university president knows. Your athletic director knows at the end, but some of you may be surprised with how little they know throughout that process. Part of the reason athletic directors at that level talk to me is because sometimes, and I'm not saying this to brag, I'm saying this to like help people understand this world. Sometimes I knew more about what was happening in their league than they did.
100%.
100%, right? And that's not Matt Brown is the Ross Dellinger of FCS football. Like, that's not true. That's just like, I got lucky in some of these conversations. So your president knows. Your AD sometimes knows. Like, I can tell you about the Big 10 and the Pac-12 move. There were Big 10 athletic directors who learned about this like on Tuesday, like 2 days before I went final, that were absolutely like not in the loop of these major conversations ahead of time. Like, that's
because they had a meeting together.
Yeah, they found out then. Yeah, so like that's a thing, right? Your senior associate athletic directors usually do not know. I know that like when UIC was considering to going into the Missouri Valley Conference, like 3 or 4 people on campus knew. Generally, at lower levels, that circle is larger than it is at higher levels because the amount of money is different, and also you have smaller staffs, so more people need to know to operationalize everything. But it is not known to everybody. Generally speaking, coaches don't know shit about shit, and they will tell reporters stuff. Assistant coaches will lie about anything if they think it will help them with recruiting, because that's what they're paid for. And they will leak stuff to message boards, and they'll talk to their local radio, and they don't know anything. And the higher level you go up, the less that they know. So like if you are somebody that mostly talks to assistant coaches about like prospects and everything, you do not know the Big Ten's target list right now. Somebody is telling you about the Big Ten target list, but that person does not know. Like, that pool does not know anything. The commissioner of the conference knows, and a very select members of senior staff, but not everybody. The comms guy at the conference that you're calling up does not know. Or just like the press secretary doesn't actually know what Joe Biden's doing right now. Like, that's not their job, or various other people. Outside of that, in my experience, people that know are major media partners, which at the FCS level is a different conversation. So the high-level executives at Fox or ESPN do have insights. There are a network of consulting companies that help with this process, either to help ESPN, Fox, or the schools determine media, like what the rights revenue would look like, or viewership would look like. There are also consulting companies at smaller levels that help shepherd schools through this process, that do feasibility studies, that the book introductions, that help people figure out what kind of scholarships or what kind of fundraising they need to do. There's not a lot of those companies. There's like 6. They often know. Some of your absolute biggest vendors might know. So people at Nike, sometimes people in the MMR world, they might know about a couple of these things. That's it. So we're talking even if it's like a mid-major thing, and maybe depending on the school, you might rope in one or two of your biggest donors. And if you're a much smaller school and you need to raise a bunch of money to make this happen, you might tell 10 donors and you give them half of the information. That's it. So you have to ask yourself then, if local radio or anybody is pushing stories about this, ask yourself, do they know one of these 12 people? And I'm not saying this to be a jerk or to say that we're so important or anything. Chances are they don't, because we talk to those people because that's our whole beat. We work for an industry publication. Like, we're the ones talking to the licensure and the sponsorships and the legal people about other stuff. And even we don't know everything that's going on. So the people that spend their times in press conferences talking about cover 4, usually they don't, just because there's just not that many of those people and they're not used to having these kind of conversations. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Well, you mentioned the booster part in particular. I mean, when it comes to a lot of those boosters / donors, if they're in really powerful positions, they're on the board of regents or whatever your university governing system will be. And so that might be when they really get roped in to a lot of those conversations. Sometimes they are the ones driving it, as we saw with Texas. Other times they're not, and they're kind of late to the process, depending on kind of where they are in the board hierarchy. I would say late in the process too. The university's general counsel gets pretty heavily involved in a lot of these things, given the amount of dollars, given the amount of contracts they have to go over just to kind of change conferences. That's obviously top of mind for some that will have to pay an exit fee and go through some of the penalty structures that a lot of these leagues have to kind of get looped into. So you're right, but you're right. I mean, there's a definite hierarchy of how these conversations happen, and I will say that there are a lot of people in this industry that do have law degrees or have been through this process enough times that they understand when when you actually reach out to the other conference and who is reaching out and when that is happening matters a lot contractually and in terms of what you might end up paying. So everybody's very aware of how that slow, delicate dance is going to happen, and I think that is key in a lot of respects when it comes to things like you're reaching out to the Big Ten. Now, at the same time, it's like, oh, you mean you reached out to the Big Ten one day and then you had a vote the next day and then you were in the conference the day after? Like, how does that process? Yes, that is technically how it happens, but there's always those informal conversations, which is how a lot of this stuff ends up leaking. But you're right. The coaches are certainly the last to know, especially the Olympic sport coaches. I can tell you they are almost always going to find out through the same media reports, even if there might be a staff meeting or whatnot scheduled. They are typically the very, 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 very last ones to know. But you're right. And the football coaches that might have an inkling of something, that's generally because they are very close to a significant booster who is also on the board of regents or tied in with the school or the AD or the president in particular.
That's what it is. It's and not every school ends up doing this. So I say all of this to say, be cautious about what you are reading and be cautious, because so-and-so is talking to so-and-so is never as straightforward as it is in real life during these conversations. Reaching out to the Big Ten might mean calling Kevin Warren. It might mean calling somebody at Fox. It might mean calling the biggest donor at Wisconsin to kind of launder something to somebody. It might mean laundering it through the media. It might mean going to Wasserman. I don't know. It could mean a bunch of different stuff. And practically, the difference might be negligible, but in practice, it could be very significant. I say all this to say here that as we're on Tuesday afternoon, the one thing I will say is the best knowledge I have is that rumors that the Pac-12 is dead and the merger with the Big 12 is imminent in some capacity are overstated. Could that happen? Yeah. I mean, shit, almost anything can happen at this point. Like, all of my baseline assumptions are being kind of revisited a little bit. Is it at far enough advanced that I think it is accurate to say like this is a very done deal or very? I don't think that's. I don't believe that that's true based on what I have been hearing. You have been hearing other things. You talk to different people than I do, but I would say conferences are real hard to kill. And the conventional wisdom that one league, as of right this very second, is in an enormously stronger position than the other league are overstated. And how this ultimately ends is very much in the air. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would agree completely. I think everybody's looking at the Big 12 and saying this, they're negotiating from a position of strength. And I would pump the brakes on that a little bit, just in terms of the timing of things. The Pac-12 is going to market before the Big 12. That is certain. And it is in Fox and ESPN's best interest for the Big 12 to be the one that ends up breaking up first and reverse merging into the Pac-12, or any sort number of scenarios that you can kind of throw out there. They would be saving quite a few, 9-figure checks, where they wouldn't have to cut it to the Big 12. From ESPN's perspective, yes, they would get marquee properties like OU and Texas, maybe a little bit earlier than 2025. And in terms of the Big Tens, they're not only taking a big chunk, or Fox's rights of the Big Ten, not only taking a big chunk of that, but they're also kind of selling that out. So now they can understand a little bit in terms of the secondary and third packages that they would have to sell from that, figuring that out, figuring the timing of that, when they would be able to talk with an NBC or a CBS to air some of those secondary and third tertiary type of games. That matters a lot to them. And so I think you're juggling a lot of balls, but at the end of the day, a lot of this is just going to rest, honestly, down to the conversation that is going to happen in South Bend, and whether Notre Dame, what they want to do, because that's going to affect pretty much every other league out there. It's affect the ACC, certainly, in terms of what they're doing with their other sports. They're contractually obligated in certain respects to join the ACC. That's a little bit fuzzy. That they could certainly end up leaving the league, going to the Big Ten. So really, it is all kind of coming down to what the Irish are going to do. That's going to impact the Pac-12, and whether maybe Oregon and Washington start flirtations with other leagues. What ends up happening with the Arizona schools and Utah and Colorado, whether they're Big 12, as much as we hear about them wanting to be aggressive, they certainly can try, but at the end of the day, you're still at a bit of a disadvantage. And keep in mind too, like the Pac-12 has been around for a long time, and those ties, although they have been shaken by this news of USC and UCLA leaving, those ties go back a long ways. The Arizona schools have been playing Stanford and Cal and Washington State and Oregon and all these for a very, very, very long time. And so I think there is certainly a close-knit community out west. It's just it is a bit different from kind of this hodgepodge that really always has been the Big 12.
Very, very different. One was made for TV. One has been mostly going on in some capacity since the 1920s. Like if you go back to the Pacific Coast Conference, but before the modern Big 12. I think, to kind of put a bow on this here, I think there are as best as I know right now, there are three major conversations happening. The big one, which you just alluded to, is what does Notre Dame decide to do? As I understand it, the financial hit from extracting themselves from the ACC is maybe not as prohibitive as previously thought, but Notre Dame's leadership from Swarbrick above is not about maximizing their revenue. It is only about making sure they have championship access. If they feel they can still do that as an independent, they're going to want to do that. I don't know, and I don't know if they've decided if the news recently has completely changed that paradigm. I don't know exactly what the timetable is for that decision. That is the fulcrum that decides what the Big Ten wants to do. Your secondary conversation is the conversations in some capacity between the Pac-12 and the Big 12. And when I say that, I mean they're member institutions, about whether you merge, whether you take some from each other. Does that make sense? What happens with your media rights? That is much less clear right now, I think, than maybe you might believe. The third conversation, to kind of really get into the weeds here, related but not exclusive to that conversation, is the Pac-12 potentially deciding to go after Gonzaga, or to potentially go after other West Coast institutions for basketball or other purposes here. I have heard this from the WCC. I've heard this from the Western mid-major world as something that is on their radar as they decide to, as the WCC looks at BYU replacements, as the WAC and Southland and Big Sky kind of fumble around there. I would say this is a storyline to watch. I'm not saying that's imminent. I'm not saying that everyone's ready to pull the trigger on that now. They're watching the same stuff everybody else is. But if you're looking for a development that would, where it would make sense for the Pac-12 to definitely change the paradigm of how they've thought about expansion and membership versus the last 12 years, brother, this is it. And that is something to kind of keep an eye on. I don't know the timelines for these things yet. Could move very quickly, could linger into football season. But those are the big questions. And so when someone asks like, hey, what does this mean for the Southland? What does this mean for the WAC or the Missouri Valley or blah, blah, blah? We got to get more clarity up top because this stuff rolls downhill. And we don't know. I don't think anybody would have predicted that Texas and Oklahoma leaving would have ultimately led to conference changes in the New England area. It did, at least at the FCS level. And depending on who moves around in the Power Five, you could see more of those changes there too. That's the best intel I got as of this afternoon.
Yeah, I mean, this is not a process that is going to be, wrapped up by next week or by conference media days. Like, it takes a lot for a lot of these universities to move leagues. And I mean, you go back to years ago when the Big 12 kind of went through the first expansion, Realignmentapalooza, and they were talking very openly with schools like Houston and others, and they were like inviting pitches. I mean, that was like 6 weeks of drama, and we're going to get basically this kind of same thing playing out, probably less publicly this time around, but it is still going to be in the backdrop of pretty much every conversation. Maybe it's something that does end up getting decided a little bit quicker than most, just given when the TV contracts are up. But at the end of the day, this is something that will play out in the background as we approach the season, as we actually turn towards the field and the on-field product on the football level in particular. As conference media days get going, we have a new Big 12 commissioner that is taking over on August 1st, I believe. So there's a lot happening. And set against the backdrop of all this, and you kind of alluded to it a little bit when talking about Notre Dame. There is a big discussion about the Irish and their place in the hierarchy when the ACC was, talking about college football playoff expansion. Well, guess what's going to happen starting in a couple of months as well. That process by those presidents, heavily involved by the commissioners that are running the college football playoff, that attention being turned towards what the sport ultimately looks like in terms of that 2026 postseason. It is going to be set, against the backdrop of all of this. It's not just, conference media deals coming up, but ultimately, what is that end goal for college football playoff? Because it's a blank slate. We could have the Big Ten just simply saying, hey, our champion's going to play the SEC champion, and everybody else can do whatever they want. Like that is an option on the table that has been discussed between people in various leagues, and including the Big Ten and the SEC. I can say that with pretty much certainty. Now, whether that ultimately ends up becoming true and whether that ultimately ends up playing out, who knows? But that is an option that is on the table. And so that would obviously force somebody like Notre Dame to join a conference.
You're absolutely right. It is worth noting, not to be alarmist, but the assumption that the current college football playoff, if it doesn't expand, will continue in its current format is not a guarantee. Will there be some kind of college football playoff? Yeah, probably. People like making money. But that, especially over the last week, what format that looks like is much more an open question than maybe it was 3 weeks ago. We could probably do another hour on this, and by the time we were done recording, the news would have changed again already, or at least from some reputable reports. So we should probably put a bow on this now. We will continue to work to advance this story the best that we can over the next coming days. I mean, I want to try to break it, but I'm not Nicole Auerbach. I'm not. I probably won't. I like my chances about breaking the next. I don't know, the next A-Sun realignment. I can't even promise that, but I like my chances better than I do here. But I do think that we'll be able, whether it's on this podcast or Extra Points, to be able to continue to advance this in a meaningful way, because there's lots of nooks and crannies to kind of fall down with this storyline. If you haven't signed up already to Collegiate Sports Connect, definitely should do that. It's totally free. You can see all the hard work that Bryan and the rest of our team did at NACDA actually get from the horse's mouth a lot of those conversations. I'm still trying to extract stuff and share those with everybody. I'll link out to the CLC interview in the show notes, since I know people are going to be interested in that. And of course, you can subscribe to Extra Points. We're doing a slightly different summer schedule. Part of it so I can have time to do more reporting. Part of it is so I don't have a nervous breakdown and die. I don't want to be over dramatic, but I need a break. We all need a little bit of a break. So we're shifting to 4 days a week for Extra Points. We're going to do going for two once a week. There might be some bonus content. If Oregon joins the ACC, and it's on a Thursday, we'll do another episode. I know we have some other things going on, but if your feed's running a little bit lower, it's not you, it's us. But we hope that you enjoyed the shows anyway. Hopefully that we can put a little bit more structure oomph behind the ones that we're doing, which you can find on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Did I get everything?
I think that's it. And if you do want to make sure you sign up for not only for extra points, but the D1 ticker as well. That's where the latest realignment gossip and news stories, what the industry is saying about the developments, not just in the Big Ten or the Pac-12 and Big 12, but across the industry at a time where there is a whole heck of a lot going on. I continue to say it. The amount of change that has happened in the past 2 years and going forward in the next 2-3 years. I mean, this is as turbulent a time in college athletics that is really has ever seen. Probably dating back to probably that 1984 court case where the Supreme Court opened up the TV rights for everybody, which led us to this moment. So it all comes full circle. It all has a through line back to somewhere. And I think the latest places where you can catch up on all of that on a daily basis is certainly D1 Ticker. And in addition to giving us 5 stars here on this here podcast.
Absolutely right. Friends, thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in. We have some other exciting stuff coming soon. See you all on the internet soon.